When I first received that notice from the HOA demanding $2,500 for fence violations, I couldn't help but chuckle, but my amusement vanished completely when HOA President Jessica Thompson stood in front of my 12-year-old daughter and claimed that the smell of cattle would lower property values in the neighborhood. I'm Luke Harrison, a third-generation resident of this land, and in that moment, Jessica made a colossal mistake. Let me tell you how this story unfolds, and if you were in my shoes, what would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let me know where you're tuning in from. Trust me, this tale is just getting started. It all began on an October Tuesday morning while I was installing a new cedar fence around the 5 acres closest to our home. My daughter, Emma, had been begging me for months to get some goats, and after losing my wife Sarah in a car accident 2 years ago, I figured giving Emma something to care for might help both of us heal. I could still see Sarah in my mind's eye, walking these same hills on warm summer evenings, her hand in mine as we watched the sky blaze with color over the land my grandfather had once worked with his own hands. Each memory made every acre more precious, each fence post a link to something bigger than myself. I was finishing up the corner post when I heard the purposeful click of high heels on the gravel behind me. Turning around, I saw a woman in her late 20s approaching with the kind of calculated stride that told me she was on an official mission. She wore a white t-shirt with a pink heart on the front, paired with an expensive-looking floral skirt that reached her knees. Her perfectly styled blonde hair defied the Texas heat, and the jewelry she wore could have stocked a small store. Her sharp gaze swept over my property, pausing on details as though she were making a mental inventory for an upcoming dispute. "Excuse me," she called out, pulling a clipboard from her oversized designer bag. "I'm Jessica Thompson, president of the Pine Hill Ranch Estates Homeowners Association. We need to talk about this fence immediately." I set down my post hole digger and walked over, keeping my voice calm and respectful, just like my father had taught me to do, no matter who came knocking. "Ma'am, I'm Luke Harrison," I said, extending the courtesy even though she was clearly spoiling for a fight. Jessica flipped through the papers on her clipboard with professional ease. "Mr. Harrison, any property that impacts the visual harmony of our community must adhere to HOA standards. This rustic fence of yours doesn't fit our aesthetic guidelines." She practically spat the word rustic like it was something foul. Her grip on the clipboard tightened until her knuckles turned white. "Mrs. Thompson," I said evenly, "this ranch has been in my family for 3 generations. It was here long before your subdivision was even a thought." That's when I caught the first glimpse of something deeper behind her polished demeanor, a flash of fear, quickly masked by her usual cool control. "We'll see about that, Mr. Harrison. The HOA has both the authority and a duty to protect property values for all residents." She pressed her pen into the paper so hard I thought it might tear. "I'll be in touch." She turned to leave, but just then, Emma came running around the corner of the house, heading toward the school bus stop. Jessica froze. For a moment, the icy calculation melted away from her face, replaced by an expression of longing, like she was staring at something she could never have. Her hand drifted to her flat stomach unconsciously, but the second Emma got close enough for the scent of livestock to hit her, Jessica's face hardened again, snapping shut like a vault. "Honey," Jessica said in a falsely sweet tone, addressing Emma directly, "doesn't this smell bother you? This odor will make the whole neighborhood unpleasant." Emma's eyes darted between Jessica and me, confusion and hurt plain on her young face. Seeing that innocent bewilderment alongside Jessica's cold, calculated cruelty lit a protective fire in my chest. I stepped forward, putting myself between Emma and Jessica. "Mrs. Thompson, I think we're done talking," I said in a low, steady voice that people who know me understand is a final warning. Jessica instinctively stepped back, clutching her clipboard like a shield. "This isn't over, Mr. Harrison." "Not by a long shot," she said before clicking down the driveway in her heels, leaving Emma and me standing in the dust. After Emma got on the school bus, I stayed there for a moment, staring at the new fence and reflecting on Jessica's words, but more importantly, on the look of confusion on my daughter's face. Jessica had tried to shame us for our way of life, and I couldn't let that stand. As Jessica's white BMW vanished down the road toward Pine Hill Ranch Estates, I had the unmistakable sense that she'd picked the wrong fight with the wrong man. 3 days later, I found an official violation notice taped to my front door. The $2,500 fine was steep enough, but the threat at the bottom really caught my eye. Continued violations may result in property seizure proceedings. I read that line twice, then laughed out loud, even as a slow burn of anger rose in my chest. Jessica either had no clue what she was talking about or was counting on me not knowing my rights. She'd clearly spent hours crafting that notice, probably at her fancy dining room table, poring over legal sites and picking out the most intimidating language she could find. The paper itself was thick, expensive letterhead, every word chosen to scare me into submission. I could imagine her hand trembling slightly as she signed her name, driven not by nerves, but by the adrenaline rush of someone convinced they're about to score a major win. That night, I went into my father's old office and dug through the box of property documents he'd kept for decades: birth certificates, marriage licenses, tax records, and then, there it was, the original deed for our 40 acres, signed and sealed in 1962. Our ranch had existed half a century before the Pine Hill development was even built. The HOA had no more control over my property than it did over the sun and moon. I made copies of everything and sat down to write a response that would leave no room for doubt. The next morning, I hand-delivered my letter straight to Jessica's door, a door that belonged to a massive, magazine-worthy colonial mansion that was about to learn exactly what kind of neighbor it was dealing with. I handed Jessica the envelope containing my response, along with copies of every document proving my property's independence. Her yard looked like a magazine cover, not a blade of grass out of place, every bush pruned with geometric precision. When she answered the door, she was dressed in yoga pants and another designer tee, her hair styled to perfection even though it was barely 8 a.m. I could tell she'd been up early, probably running through scenarios in her mind. "Mr. Harrison," she greeted, her voice oozing false politeness that barely hid the gleam of triumph in her eyes. I stayed calm. "Mrs. Thompson, I thought you'd want to look over these before taking this any further. You'll find that my land isn't under the HOA's jurisdiction, and any attempt to fine me or threaten seizure could be considered harassment under state law." She didn't even bother reading the documents, just flicked her hand dismissively. "Mr. Harrison, I don't think you quite understand how we operate around here," she said, her tone turning icy. "My husband, Brian, has ties all over this county. The HOA has rights that go beyond mere property lines." Her voice was equal parts smug and desperate. I recognized that Blenda had meant she'd used these tactics before, and they'd worked, but she was about to learn she'd picked the wrong target this time. By the following week, Jessica's campaign against me was in full swing. County inspectors started dropping by, environmental health, building code, you name it. They all wore the same uneasy expression once they realized they were being manipulated into a neighbor's personal feud. They found nothing amiss because there was nothing, and left shaking their heads at the waste of time and taxpayer money. I documented every visit, every complaint, every scrap of paper. The last straw came when I got home one evening to find Emma sobbing in the kitchen. "Dad," she choked out, "Mrs. Thompson called the school. She told them we're living in unsafe conditions because of the animals. They asked me all these questions about whether I felt safe here." Seeing my 12-year-old daughter dragged into this petty war ignited something cold and protective in me. Jessica had crossed a line she'd never be able to walk back from. That night, I called Helen McCarthy, my neighbor of 20 years. Her voice was a conspiratorial whisper when she told me, "Luke, Jessica's been going around with a petition, trying to get people to sign complaints against you. She's telling folks your cattle will drive down property values." Most of the old-timers aren't buying it, but she's got a few signatures from newer families who don't know any better. Half the HOA board thinks she's gone too far, but they're too scared to stand up to her. The next morning, things escalated again. I found a notice taped to my door from the county planning office. Jessica, or more likely Brianna, had filed a petition to rezone my land from agricultural to residential only. The hearing was set for next month, and if they succeeded, I'd lose not just the right to farm, but the ag tax break that kept this land in our family. I knew then this wasn't just about a fence or property values. Jessica and Brian were trying to force me off my land so they could swoop in and buy it at a steal. I sat in my truck for a long time, staring at the pasture where my grandfather and father had worked. The anger that had been simmering for weeks finally crystallized into something unshakable: resolve. If Jessica thought she could bully a Harrison into giving up everything we built here, she was about to find out what happened when you pushed one of us too far. The county planning office was buzzing with activity when I walked in the Monday morning, my briefcase stuffed with decades of history and a resolve that couldn't be shaken. I'd taken the day off from my landscaping business to do my homework, and what I'd found made my blood boil. This wasn't the first time Brian Thompson's company had pulled this trick, which meant there were legal precedents I could use. Pete Rodriguez, the county commissioner, looked uneasy when I sat down across from his desk. Pete had known my family for years, and I could tell he hated being dragged into this mess. "Luke," he said carefully, "I've got to tell you, Brian Thompson's company has some serious backing. They've submitted a detailed plan for the whole area, claiming it's in the public interest." He slid a folder across the desk. I opened it to see glossy renderings of luxury homes, parks, and winding driveways, but buried in the fine print was the real story. Brian's company had already locked in purchase options on 3 neighboring properties contingent on getting my land rezoned. Without the agricultural exemption, I'd have no choice but to sell. I closed the folder and met Pete's eyes. "Tell me something, Peta, how many other family farms have the Thompsons taken this way?" He didn't answer at first, but the look on his face was all I needed to see. It wasn't the first time someone had raised concerns about the Thompsons' shady business tactics, and that was all the confirmation I needed. For the next 2 weeks, I worked like a man possessed, preparing for the public hearing as if my family's entire future depended on it, because, in many ways, it did. I dug up historical records going all the way back to the 1940s, proving that our land had been in agricultural use since long before the subdivisions sprouted up around us. I studied property law and zoning regulations until I could practically recite them word for word. And most importantly, I reached out to other ranchers and farmers in the county who'd fought similar battles. What I learned was clear: bullies like the Thompsons only pushed as far as people let them. When they met organized resistance, they tended to back down. The hearing was held at the county courthouse on a Thursday evening. Jessica showed up looking like she was headed to a high-powered corporate boardroom, not a community forum. She had a team of lawyers from Dallas in tow, their lead attorney a sharply dressed woman whose hourly rate probably exceeded what most folks made in a week. Brian Thompson lounged in the front row, checking his phone like this was just another day at the office. Jessica took the floor first, delivering a polished speech about property values, community standards, and the greater good. She gestured at a slick, poster-sized chart that claimed property values in mixed agricultural residential areas were plummeting because of noise, smells, and health hazards tied to livestock. Then it was my turn. I rose slowly, scanning the room, taking in the faces of neighbors I'd known my whole life. My grandfather had bought this land in 1942 with savings from working double shifts at the refinery. My father had grown up here, expanded the ranch, and raised his family. For 3 generations, we'd paid taxes, supported local businesses, and raised our kids on this ground. I spread the historical documents across the table. "This ranch was here before the subdivision," I said steadily, "before the HOA, and before the Thompsons ever set foot in this county." The room fell silent. This isn't just about zoning. It's about a developer trying to force out longtime residents to line their own pockets. I turned to Brian, who finally glanced up from his phone. "Mr. Thompson's company has used this exact strategy in 3 other communities, forcing family farms into financial distress with bogus zoning challenges and buying them up for pennies on the dollar." Jessica couldn't hold her tongue. She leapt up, her face red with anger. "That's completely false. We're creating a beautiful, cohesive community, something that benefits everyone." Her voice rose, turning into a shrill shout. People in the audience shifted in their seats. "Mr. Harrison is just being stubborn and refusing to adapt to changing times." The county commissioners exchanged glances. Finally, Commissioner Sarah Walsh spoke. "Given the complexity of these issues and the conflicting information tonight, we're postponing our decision for 30 days to allow for a full review." It wasn't the victory I'd hoped for, but it wasn't a defeat either. As the crowd filed out, a few Pine Hill residents approached me, faces apologetic. "Mr. Harrison, said one older man. "I signed that petition because Jessica said you were turning the ranch into a commercial operation." "I didn't realize this was about forcing you off your land." 3 others nodded in agreement, and I could see that Jessica's support was already starting to crack. People might fall for a lie once, but they don't like being lied to when the truth starts to show. Packing up my documents, I caught sight of Jessica standing alone by her car, tears streaking down her cheeks. Brian was already driving away, leaving her to face the fallout alone. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her, but then I remembered the way my daughter had cried, terrified that we might lose our home. Some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. That night, I sat in my father's old office until nearly 3 a.m. Law books I'd borrowed from the county library were piled high, legal documents spread across every inch of the desk. Emma had gone to bed long before, but sleep was the last thing on my mind. I'd spent years learning how to work the land, how to read the lay of it, how to build it up, but this was different. This was a fight, and I needed to find a weapon. I found it in a dusty box of old survey maps and mineral rights paperwork that my grandfather had stashed away decades ago. Near the bottom was a faded sheet of paper, dated 1943, a livestock easement granting legal right-of-way for cattle through what was now the Pine Hill Ranch Estates subdivision. The easement had never been revoked or challenged, which meant it still held. I leaned back in my chair and let out a laugh, probably loud enough to wake Emma if she wasn't such a sound sleeper. Jessica and Brian Thompson had no idea what they'd stirred up. They thought they were dealing with another easy target. Well, they were about to learn that a family that had worked this land since before the first subdivision was even a blueprint wouldn't be forced out without a fight. The next morning, I called Jake Martinez, an agricultural lawyer known for his creative approaches to land disputes. He'd helped other ranchers in the county fend off developers and hold on to their livelihoods. When I showed him the easement document, his grin was almost as wide as mine. "Luke, this is exactly the leverage we need," he said. "If we can show continuous agricultural use and establish that this easement was never legally revoked." A broken bar. Jake grinned when he saw the document. "We're not just going to protect your ranch," he said. "We're going to push for the county to recognize this easement's historical agricultural use, which could actually expand your zoning rights." While Jake worked out the legal strategy, I reached out to other ranchers in the county. The agricultural community in Texas is tight-knit, and word spreads fast when one of our own is threatened. Within a week, 5 ranchers had agreed to loan me cattle for what we jokingly called the Educational Grazing Project. The plan was simple: prove that livestock had always used this land and that modern development shouldn't erase those historical rights. Emma was thrilled by the idea of more cows around, but she was also nervous. "Dad, what if Mrs. Thompson gets really mad when the cows show up?" she asked one evening as we fed her goats. I knelt beside her and let the goats nuzzle my hand. "Sometimes adults make bad choices when they're scared or angry," I said, "but that doesn't mean we stop doing what's right." She nodded solemnly, then smiled. "Can I help take care of the cows when they get here?" The cattle arrived on a crisp November morning, 30 head of mixed-breed cows and steers that took to the pastures like they'd always belonged there. I kept them well within our property lines, but their presence was impossible to ignore for the residents of Pine Hill Ranch Estates. Designer mailboxes and manicured lawns met the sight of grazing cattle, an image that didn't sit well with the HOA's carefully crafted image. I set up a folding chair along the fence line and waited for Jessica's reaction. I didn't have to wait long. Within 2 hours, her white BMW came barreling down the main street. 10 minutes later, she was striding across my field like she owned the place. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, waving an arm at the cattle. "You can't just bring cows in here without permits or environmental impact studies." Her white t-shirt was already showing sweat stains despite the cool morning air, and her carefully styled hair was starting to come undone. "Mrs. Thompson, these cattle are grazing on my property," I said calmly, not even bothering to get up. "It's a legitimate agricultural operation. All the permits and health inspections are current and up to date." I didn't mention that I'd placed the cattle to ensure they could use the historical easement if necessary. "If you have concerns, I'd suggest calling the County Agricultural Extension Office." Jessica's face turned a deep shade of red, clashing with her outfit. "This is harassment. You're doing this just to spite me and the homeowners association." She whipped out her phone and began frantically dialing. "I'm calling the sheriff right now." I nodded, still seated, and turned my attention back to the cows. Sheriff Tom Bradley had known my family for decades, and he understood the difference between a legitimate agricultural operation and an actual problem. 20 minutes later, his patrol car rolled up and he stepped out, wearing the weary look of a man who'd seen enough hoe disputes for a lifetime. "Morning, Luke." "Jessica, what's going on here?" Jessica launched into a long rant about livestock invasions and property values. I simply handed Tom the stack of permits and the easement documents that Jake had helped me prepare. He spent several minutes flipping through the paperwork, occasionally glancing up at the cattle and then back at Jessica's increasingly agitated expression. Finally, he closed the folder and handed it back to me. "Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Harrison's cattle are grazing legally on his own property. Unless those cows wander into your subdivision or cause damage, there's nothing illegal here." Jessica's mouth opened and closed a few times, but no sound came out. After Tom left, she retreated to her house, her shoulders stiff with frustration. I sat back in my chair, watching the cows as they settled into graze. Phase 1 of my plan was complete, but there were still 30 days until the next zoning hearing, and I intended to use every one of them. The response from Pine Hill Ranch Estates was swift and predictable. By noon, I'd seen at least 15 cars slow down to stare at the cattle, with a few even pulling over to take pictures. Most residents seemed curious rather than angry, especially the kids, who were fascinated by the sight of real cows so close to home. Emma was in her element, proudly showing off the animals to any child brave enough to come to the fence. But Jessica Thompson was not amused. I watched from the kitchen window as she stormed from house to house, clipboard in hand, trying to rally support. Her BMW made half a dozen trips up and down the street that afternoon, and every time she drove past my property, she slowed down to glare at the cows like they were personally insulting her. The first official retaliation came in the form of an urgent home meeting notice hand-delivered to every house in the subdivision that evening. "Emergency livestock invasion threatens property values," the heading read in bold letters, followed by a list of health and safety concerns so exaggerated they would have been funny if they weren't so desperate. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. the next night, and every resident was strongly encouraged to attend. I decided to go as well, not as a resident, of course, but as a neighbor who wanted to understand the community's concerns, if only to make sure my daughter and I were ready for whatever might come next. The meeting took place in Jessica's oversized garage, which she transformed into a makeshift conference room with folding chairs and a projection screen. About 25 people showed up, representing maybe half the neighborhood. Jessica stood at the front of the garage-turned-meeting room, dressed in a navy blazer over her usual designer t-shirt, trying hard to project authority. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," she said, her voice tight and her expression strained. "As you all know, we're facing an unprecedented threat to our community's peace and property values." She clicked a remote, and the projection screen came to life with a PowerPoint presentation titled, "Agricultural Encroachment, a Clear and Present Danger." The next 20 minutes were a masterclass in alarmism and selective facts. Jessica rattled off statistics about disease transmission from livestock, claimed property values would plummet because of agricultural odors, and insisted cattle would bring swarms of insects. She even cited noise pollution from bellowing cows and warned of damage from wandering herds. It was thoroughly meticulously crafted and completely out of touch with reality. When she finally wrapped up, Jessica opened the floor for questions. An elderly man in the front row raised his hand right away. "Jessica, I drove by the Harrison place this morning, and those cattle looked healthy and calm. My grandkids were thrilled to see them. Are we sure this is even a problem?" Several residents murmured agreement, and I saw the first crack in Jessica's confident facade. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice rising, "I understand the kids might find them charming, but we have to think about the long-term effects. Today it's 30 cows, tomorrow it's 100. Then we're dealing with feedlots and slaughterhouses in our neighborhood." It was the classic slippery slope argument, but it wasn't working. A younger woman near the back raised her hand. Has anyone actually asked Mr. Harrison about his plans? Has he said he's going to expand or cause trouble? The question hung in the air. Jessica flushed a deep red. That's not the point, Karen, she snapped. The point is we can't let agricultural activities dictate the character of our community. That's when Helen McCarthy stood up. In her late 60s and a retired teacher, Helen had lived next to my ranch for over 20 years and she had everyone's respect. Jessica, she said calmly, I've been Luke Harrison's neighbor since before this subdivision was even built. His family has always been responsible and respectful of their land. This presentation makes it sound like he's running some industrial farming operation, but he's just got a few dozen cattle grazing on pasture that's been used for livestock for over 60 years. The room buzzed with whispered conversations, and I could see the tide turning. Jessica tried to bring the meeting back under control by calling for a formal vote on a resolution demanding I remove the cattle immediately. But the motion failed, 12 against, 8 in favor, and 5 abstentions. As the meeting broke up, several neighbors came up to me to offer quiet support and apologies for the fuss. Walking back to my truck, I felt both satisfied and wary. Jessica had overplayed her hand. She'd turned what could have been a civil conversation into a campaign of misinformation and it had backfired. But I also knew that a cornered opponent can be dangerous. The next morning confirmed my hunch. I received a notice from the county planning office. My petition to expand the agricultural zoning of the easement had been approved for public review. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks from then. I had until that day to make the case that historical agricultural rights should take precedence over new subdivisions. Jessica had wanted a fight and she was going to get one, but on my terms. The county courthouse was packed on the night of the zoning hearing, with more people than I'd ever seen at a local meeting. Word had spread through the ranching community about the stakes, and ranchers from 3 counties showed up to stand with me. On the other side of the aisle, Jessica sat with her hired legal team, though I noticed Brian Thompson was nowhere to be seen. Jessica had spared no expense. Her lead attorney was a slick-looking woman from Dallas, a land use specialist, and they had a stack of thick binders ready for battle. When it was their turn, the lawyer launched into a smooth presentation about modern zoning, public health, and the need for orderly development in a growing community. We're not here to challenge Mr. Harrison's connection to his land, she said, her tone calm and rehearsed. However, times have changed, and the needs of this neighborhood have changed as well. Mixing agricultural operations with residential development inevitably creates conflict in the 21st century. She gestured to charts and graphs, showing supposed drops in property values and quality of life when agricultural zoning overlapped with subdivisions. But then Jessica made the same mistake she had at the home meeting as she took the floor herself, eager to control the narrative instead of letting her lawyer handle it. Jessica insisted on speaking for herself. She stood up in another designer outfit, a navy suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, and launched into an emotional appeal that quickly morphed into something else entirely. Commissioners, she began, her voice quivering slightly, I came to this community 3 years ago with a vision to create a place where families could raise their children in safety and beauty, where property values would be protected, and where everyone could take pride in their neighborhood. So far, so good. But I could see her composure beginning to crack. But Mr. Harrison refuses to be part of that vision, she continued, her voice rising. He's selfish and stubborn, clinging to outdated ways of life that have no place in a modern community. He's using his cattle as weapons, deliberately placing them where they'll cause the most disruption to our peaceful neighborhood. The mask was slipping. The real Jessica Thompson was starting to emerge. I have worked tirelessly to make Pine Hill Ranch Estates the kind of place people want to live, she said, her tone turning shrill, a place that attracts successful families and maintains property values. But one stubborn rancher thinks his personal preferences are more important than the greater good of the entire community. By now, she was practically shouting, and several people in the audience were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. When it was my turn to speak, I rose slowly and looked around the room at the faces of people I'd known for most of my life. I didn't have a team of lawyers or a stack of expensive reports, but I had something better, the truth. Commissioners, I began, 3 generations of my family have worked this land, paid taxes on it, and contributed to this community. We've never been a problem for our neighbors, and we're not a problem now. I pulled out the historical documents my grandfather had carefully preserved and my father had handed down to me. This ranch was established in 1942, decades before any residential development in this area. We've maintained continuous agricultural use, followed every regulation, and always respected our neighbors' rights. What Mrs. Thompson is asking you to do is punish us for existing before her subdivision was ever built. Then I dropped the bombshell. Jake Martinez and I had been preparing for weeks. But there's something else the commissioners need to know, I said, my voice calm and steady. Mrs. Thompson's husband operates a development company that has used identical tactics in 3 other locations to force family farms off their land at below market prices. They file zoning challenges, create artificial conflicts, and then swoop in with purchase offers when the landowners can't afford to fight anymore. The room erupted in hushed conversations, and I saw Jessica's face drain of color. Her attorney frantically shuffled through papers, clearly caught off guard. I went on, we've documented a pattern of harassment, frivolous complaints, and legal intimidation designed to force my family off land we've owned and worked for 60 years. This isn't about zoning or property values, it's about corporate greed and the systematic elimination of family farms. That was when Jessica completely lost her composure. She leapt to her feet, ignoring her attorney's attempts to hold her back. That's a lie, she shrieked. We're not trying to steal anyone's land, we just want to live in a decent neighborhood without having to smell cow manure every time we step outside. Her voice had risen to a near hysterical pitch, tears of frustration streaming down her face. I've put everything I have into making that community perfect, she sobbed. I quit my job, I gave up my career, I dedicated my life to creating something beautiful, and you want to let one selfish man destroy it all because of some stupid piece of paper from the 1940s. The raw desperation in her voice was almost painful to witness, but it also revealed more than she probably intended: to fear, insecurity, and an obsessive need to control everything around her. Commissioner Sarah Walsh called for order and gave Jessica a moment to compose herself, but the damage was done. The mask had fallen away completely, exposing the true nature of her crusade against my family. As I scanned the room, I noticed several residents of Pine Hill Ranch Estates looking embarrassed, some even shaking their heads in quiet disgust. When the commissioners voted, it wasn't even close. They approved my petition to extend the agricultural zoning by a margin of 4-1, with Commissioner Rodriguez abstaining due to a potential conflict of interest. The historical easement rights were recognized and enforced, meaning livestock would continue to have legal access to graze in the areas that had been used for that purpose for over 60 years. As people filed out of the courthouse, several Pine Hill residents approached me with quiet apologies and even offers of support. Mr. Harrison, one of them said, shaking my hand, I had no idea Jessica was planning to force you out. A woman whose children had been fascinated by the cattle approached me. We moved here because we wanted a peaceful neighborhood, not to destroy family farms, she said. Others nodded in agreement, and in that moment, I realized Jessica hadn't just lost the legal battle, she had lost the support of her own community. The aftermath of the zoning hearing unfolded faster than I could have imagined. Within a week, Jessica Thompson was removed as president of the Pine Hill Ranch Estates Homeowners Association by an emergency vote of no confidence. The HOA board, embarrassed by her public meltdown and the negative publicity it generated, elected Helen McCarthy as interim president and immediately began reaching out to me about establishing a more cooperative relationship. But Jessica's problems were only just beginning. The pattern of harassment and intimidation we had documented during the zoning fight attracted the attention of the state attorney general's office, which launched an investigation into Thompson Development's business practices. It turned out that Brian Thompson's company had used the same tactics in 4 other locations, systematically targeting family farms and small property owners who couldn't afford long legal battles. Within a month, Brian Thompson faced multiple lawsuits from landowners who had been pressured into selling their properties at below-market prices. His development company's reputation was in shambles, and several major investors withdrew from pending projects. The strain of these legal troubles, combined with Jessica's increasingly erratic behavior, proved too much for their marriage. Brian filed for divorce in December, citing irreconcilable differences and seeking to distance himself from his wife's actions. Meanwhile, Jessica became something of a pariah in her own neighborhood. Most Pine Hill residents went out of their way to avoid her, and the few who still supported her seemed more concerned about their own property values than any genuine friendship. She tried to maintain the facade of her perfect suburban lifestyle, but without Brian's income and with mounting legal bills, it crumbled quickly. By spring, a for sale sign appeared in front of the Thompson house, and Jessica moved to a small apartment across town. I heard through Helen McCarthy that she had found work at a garden center, trying to rebuild her life from scratch. Part of me felt sorry for her, but I couldn't forget the tears in my daughter's eyes when Jessica tried to shame her about our family's way of life. The real vindication came 6 months after the zoning hearing, when the county designated our ranch as a historical landmark. The recognition brought with it not only legal protection but also a significant increase in property values, as the historical designation made the area more attractive to buyers who appreciated authentic Texas heritage. Emma was thrilled when the historical marker was installed near our front gate, commemorating 3 generations of the Harrison family's contributions to the community. But the sweetest form of payback was yet to come. The agricultural zoning extension I'd fought for had an unexpected benefit. It made the area eligible for agritourism activities. With Helen McCarthy's enthusiastic support, I began offering monthly cattle drives through the public easement area, including parts of what had once been Jessica's picture-perfect subdivision. The Heritage Ranch tours became a huge hit, drawing families from across the region who wanted their children to experience authentic ranch life. Emma appointed herself as the head tour guide, confidently sharing the history of Texas cattle ranching while leading groups of wide-eyed city kids on horseback rides through the same pastures where my grandfather once worked. The irony wasn't lost on any. Jessica's efforts to banish agricultural activities had resulted in even more cattle, more tourists, and more disruption to the suburban peace she'd fought so hard to maintain. But the truly surprising part? Property values in Pine Hill Ranch estates actually rose because of the heritage designation and the agritourism activities. It turned out people were willing to pay extra to live next to authentic Texas history. One afternoon in late summer, Emma and I were fixing a fence when I noticed a familiar figure working at the garden center across the highway. Jessica Thompson was loading mulch bags for a customer, her designer outfits replaced by work clothes and a sun hat. She looked up and saw me watching her. For a moment, our eyes met across the distance. She raised her hand in what might have been a wave or a silent acknowledgement, and I nodded back. Sometimes, people have to lose everything before they can find out who they really are. That evening, while we watched the sunset from our front porch, Emma asked me, "Dad, do you think Mrs. Thompson learned anything from what happened?" I thought about that for a long time before answering. "I hope so, sweetheart. Everyone deserves a chance to make things right, but they have to want to change first." Emma nodded solemnly, then brightened. "Do you think she'll ever come to one of our ranch tours?" I laughed and pulled her closer. Now that would be something to see. The cattle in the pasture settled down for the night, their gentle lowing mixing with the sound of crickets and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. 3 generations of my family had sat on that same porch, watching the same sunset over the same land. Now, Emma would carry that tradition forward. Jessica Thompson had tried to take that away from us. Instead, she'd helped us fight for Ita and make it stronger than ever. Sometimes, the biggest battles aren't won with anger or revenge, but with patience, principle, and the courage to stand up for what's right. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the people who try to destroy what you love end up helping you preserve it forever. From all of us here at Ya Stories, thank you for watching. Smash that like button, drop a comment, and join us again for more unbelievable stories.